Go for it, Johnny.
Okay, good afternoon, and thank you all for coming and attending. I'm Johnny Alex. I happen to be on the board of SEEP, but I will be your moderator for this afternoon. I am from Indianapolis, Indiana. I belong to Christ Church Cathedral there, and I am also on the vestry there, past senior warden. I would like to introduce to you our first panelist, who is Mr. Jim Elrod. And Jim, I'm going to let you tell them who you are because you know what you want them to hear.
Hey, Johnny, thanks so much. Well, welcome everybody. I'm delighted you're here. I am Jim Elrod. I'm a parishioner at Christ Church in Greenwich, Connecticut. I don't know many of you, but I have presented at SEEP before, so I may have met some of you along the way. I am on the faculty at Yale Divinity School, and I'm a member of the Berkeley at Yale board. Grace?
Absolutely. My name is Grace Duddy Pomroy, and like Jim, I'm also on the faculty of the seminary. I'm on the faculty of Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota, where I'm the director of the Stewardship Leaders Program and teach some classes. And I'm located in downtown Minneapolis, so apologies in advance for any street noise that you hear.
Wow. Before we get started, let me say one little logistic. We are going to, or we'd like for you to hold questions until the end. And if you get a little bit excited and can't hold it until the end, just write it in the chat room, and then we will look at it when the seminar is over. Okay? Jim, you going first?
Yes, ma'am. Thanks, Johnny. Well, transparency, particularly financial transparency, is, at least on the surface, one of those mom and apple pie values in most mainline churches. Transparent? Well, of course we're transparent. Or maybe to put it another way, have you ever been to a vestry meeting where somebody pounded the table and advocated for obfuscation? Probably not. But in my experience, discussing with church leaders what transparency actually means is similar to Abraham Lincoln's efforts to discuss liberty with his first war cabinet. Lincoln, in reflecting on those conversations, later said, "We all declare for liberty, but in using the same word, we do not all mean the same thing." And so it is with transparency. There's no agreed upon definition of what it means in a church context to be transparent, and thus there's no consensus on what it's supposed to look like in a church context. What we do know is that in most mainline Protestant denominations, and certainly in the Episcopal tradition, our conception of financial transparency is anchored pretty firmly in our sense of compliance. There are certain things our diocese tells us we need to do, and other stakeholders like the IRS sometimes weigh in. We go do them, and then we report that we've done them, and therefore we're being transparent. Take, for example, our canonical requirement that the books of account shall be so kept as to provide the basis for satisfactory accounting. Well, what most churches do is purchase accounting software and hire a bookkeeper or financial experts. We engage a certified public accountant to audit the financial statements that they prepare, and when we get a clean audit opinion, please God, they share it with their members, and usually in summary form at their annual meeting. So we've complied, with the rules. We've informed our membership, and we are therefore being transparent. Does that sound familiar? Well, Grace and I believe that your church should embrace a more expansive view of financial transparency for two reasons. Well, first, it's a good thing to do. And second, you're really not going to have much of a choice in just a few short years. I'll get to that. It's a good thing to do because most churches really do try to act as God's arms and legs in the world. And sharing your operating results allows your members to see that you're serious about your mission. And for seekers and potential new members, they can then see opportunities for engagement in addition to what goes on in a worship service on Sunday morning. If I could call on another 19th century luminary, John D. Rockefeller, who, by the way, was a very devout Northern Baptist. Rockefeller said, next to doing the right thing, the most important thing is to let people know that you are doing the right thing. And so financial transparency is a good thing to practice. But Grace and I believe that most churches need to reconsider their notion of financial transparency because your membership is going to change and they're going to demand it. In 2018, the Lake Institute on Faith and Giving, located down the street from Johnny, conducted a survey on the financial condition of about 1,200 churches of all kinds, all denominations, and they published the results in a document entitled The National Study of Congregations' Economic Practices. It's freely available on the internet, and while I don't recommend you go Google it now, I would encourage you to get it and read it. And one of the things the Lake Institute concluded, which won't come as a huge surprise to anybody on this call, is that churches depend on the direct contributions of their members. In fact, in the churches that they surveyed, 81% of the revenue of the average church came from member donations. And in 40% of the case, in other words, 2 out of every 5 churches, 100% of the revenue came from member donations. Now, SEEP institutions, by definition, have a more diversified revenue base than that average church. And yet I'm willing to bet that that headline still holds true, that your church depends on the financial support of its members to keep its doors open. So what do we know about the average Episcopal church? Well, to my knowledge, the most recent major demographic study of the denomination was conducted by the National Church back in 2014, so 7 years ago. 7 years ago, 55% of all Episcopalians were 50 or older. So in generational terms, we were lousy with matures and baby boomers. They are a distinct majority, and there's nothing that makes me think that that's changed in the intervening years. And compare that, for example, to 34% at the time of the US population being over 50. So we're overly reliant on matures and baby boomers. Now, combine these two realities. Episcopal churches are highly dependent on their members for their economic viability. And on average, the majority of Episcopal churches have matures or baby boomer generations as their members. So take those fun facts from the past and pivot with me and look out the windshield for a second to the year 2030, not too far from now, just the next decade. In 2030, the average mature, those still with us, will be 95 years old. Enough said on that. In 2030, the average baby boomer will be 75 years old, well into retirement, spending down their assets to support their lifestyle. I am a baby boomer. This does not make me happy, but that's what's going on. And while, of course, there'll always be exceptions on an individual personal basis, the unavoidable truth of that is that if you think your church is still going to rely on member contributions during the next decade to remain viable, then that financial support is going to have to come from a different generation or different generations. And enter the millennials. In 2030, the average millennial will only be 45 years old, smack in the middle of their prime income producing years, and in many instances, controlling or inheriting family wealth that was formerly held by their mature grandparents or their boomer parents. Now, the challenge for churches and for secular nonprofits as well is that there's lots of information to suggest that millennials don't really want to practice philanthropy the same way that their parents and their grandparents did. They have very different expectations about how charitable institutions are supposed to react to them and interact with them. And at the very center of those expectations is a very different view about financial transparency. Now, if it was just me telling you this, a card-carrying baby boomer, you might be tempted to listen patiently. You might wonder why Joe arranged this in the first place, and you go about your business. And that's why I'm so proud to have Grace Pomroy join us today. She is a card-carrying millennial. I'm very proud of her. And Grace has thought a lot about church, a lot about millennial engagement, and I think you're going to see in just a few moments, she has some very compelling evidence to share with us about why we need to think differently about financial transparency in our churches. So Grace, over to you.
Thanks so much, Jim. That was so incredibly helpful to set the stage on why transparency matters, particularly through a generational lens. So I'm going to share my screen with you all, but as I'm doing that, I thought it might be interesting for you guys to know a bit about how Jim and I became connected with one another. As you heard in our bios, we are both faculty members at different seminaries across the country. And while that was our original means of introduction, actually what allowed Jim and I to really get to know one another well was Jim kind of taking a chance and sending me a chapter of his upcoming book. And we had so many rich conversations, and I ended up reading more chapters and offering feedback, asking questions. It was just such a great experience to get to learn and get to know one another. And fun fact, this is actually only the second time I've ever seen Jim's face. We've gotten to know each other in the midst of the pandemic. And so this has also been an exciting part of the experience. I would encourage you guys to check out Jim's book. It is coming out on June 17th. And I have read most, if not all, of the chapters and can give it my hearty consent that there's a lot in there related to church finance and transparency in particular that I know you will find helpful. So I encourage you to take a look at that, and maybe Jim can give us some more information on when and how to get that book later on in the presentation. But for now, let's dive into this topic of millennials and particularly look at Gen Xers and Gen Zers as well. I always like to begin my presentation by naming assumptions. Assumptions are those things that kind of sneak in there when we begin talking about these generations that we don't often want to admit or talk about. And I think especially given the fact that most of the groups that I speak to in the area of stewardship tend to be baby boomer dominated, it's really important for us to take a step back and say, what are some assumptions that we have when we even hear the title of this webinar, Millennials Rising? What are we thinking of when we hear the word millennial and Gen Xer and Gen Zer? And also give you guys just a little piece of information. I will go through all these generations in detail in just a moment. So if I've already lost you in terms of the terminology, don't worry, there's more information coming soon. But for now, just think of what comes to mind for you when you hear these words. In the middle of your screen, you'll see some Time magazine articles that were written about the different generations. Time magazine seems to have a history of kind of painting some of these assumptions, splashing them right across the front page. On the top, we see some information about Gen Xers. On the left side, we see some Gen Xers wandering around aimlessly in all Black clothing on the screen. We get the image that they are the lost generation, that they're critical, that they're loners. We get on the right side of the page another version of the assumptions about Generation X. If you can't read the text, I'll read it for you. You called us slackers. You dismissed us as Generation X. Well, move over. We are not what you thought. We get the image of Generation X as the rebel, as the individualist. These might be some of the images that come to mind for you when you hear about Generation X. Going down to the middle, to my generation that I'm proud to be a part of, we see the millennials. On the left side, we have the gentleman who's in his work clothes, who's sitting inside of a sandbox with the tagline, "They just won't grow up." I'm guessing you may have heard about millennials that we won't grow up, we won't commit, and we want to live at home with our parents in their basement. Now, I say that tongue in cheek because here I am sitting here not following any of those assumptions, and yet I've often had those assumptions placed on me when I admit that I'm a millennial. On the right side of the screen, you see the woman in the gorgeous yellow skinny jeans, laying on that studio mat and looking with her phone pressed against her face. Millennials are known as narcissistic, entitled. They believe they should have the same jobs that their parents had without having to work for it, and attached to their technology. Similarly, we see Generation Z. We look on the bottom of the screen. We have a Time magazine piece, which is a little bit less abrasive, I would say, than the previous generations. We see Generation Pandemic, and a McLean's cover there that shows us a little bit of a different side of Generation Z. Generation Z is known as tech dependent. They have a short attention span. They're multitaskers. These folks are going to be entrepreneurs. They want to work for themselves, not for you. Job hoppers, hard to please. Are some of these things that come to mind for you when you hear about these different generations? I'm guessing they have, because some of these even come to mind for me, because these are things that end up talked about in the media. I think it's really important that we take the time to name these assumptions, to begin to think about the assumptions that have been placed on us to form empathy for others, but also to begin to think about how these assumptions change our relationship as we're trying to have generosity and stewardship conversations with those in our congregation or those who might be interested in joining our work in our congregation. I think it's really important that we take a step back from these assumptions, set them aside for the rest of the conversation so we can learn more in a data-driven way about who these folks are. So next, I'm going to give you guys a generational overview. Most of this is coming from the Blackbaud study, Next Generation of American Giving. You can find that online. It's a fantastic resource, and I encourage you to check it out. I'm mostly going to focus on Gen X, Gen Z, and Millennials, as we talked about, but I am also going to show you some data on the baby boomers, just to give us a comparison factor. So let's dive in. Before I do this, just so you know, I am going to go through this fairly quickly, just so we can level set the stage. Remember, this is a recorded presentation, so you're welcome to go back. I'm also very happy to share the Prezi presentation with any of you who might be interested in it, so don't feel like you need to get a hand cramp trying to write out all the notes from this. So let's start out with our baby boomers. I'm guessing you may know a lot about this generation. Birth dates are 1946 to 1964, at least according to the Pew Research Center. Ages 75 to 57 in 2021. These folks tended to be either children of or even sometimes participating in the civil rights movement. The Vietnam War for many baby boomers was a part of their coming of age experience. And of course, Woodstock comes into the mix as well. Let's see what we know about their patterns for generosity. 75% of folks in this generation give. And they give on average about $1,000 per year across 4 different charities. And again, as it comes as no surprise, and as Jim just shared a few minutes ago, baby boomers represent the largest cross-section of the total giving pie. Around 41% of total giving is coming from the baby boomer demographic. Now let's think about how these folks like to give. I often joke that baby boomers like the whole buffet line. They're interested in mail solicitation, which is that little envelope you see on the top. They're interested in giving online, particularly giving via a computer, but this could also be an iPad or another type of mobile device. On the bottom, we have an image for crowdfunding. Now, I'm guessing many of you may have heard of crowdfunding before. GoFundMe, Kickstarter, those are crowdfunding type sites, but it doesn't necessarily have to be online. Crowdfunding is about bringing together micro or small gifts to make macro impact. Some of you may remember a few years ago when Hurricane Katrina happened and they did that concert on TV, and there was that little line on the bottom that said, text $10 to this number and it'll make a big impact. And millions of dollars was raised through that concert just by many, many people making a $10 gift. On the right side, you see the F, which stands for Facebook, and that is social media giving. And then below that is text giving, giving via mobile device. And as you can see, for those in the baby boomer demographic, mail solicitation, online giving, and crowdfunding are their main channels for giving. Taking a look at giving priorities, local social service organizations is on the top for this group, followed by places of worship and health charities. So let's take a look at Generation X. Generation X's birth dates are 1964 to 1980, ages 56 to 41. For coming of age experience for Generation X, many will talk about the fall of the Berlin Wall as being part of their coming of age moment. Many Gen Xers were also latchkey kids, and they were the first generation of latchkey kids in that they were given a key because neither parent was at home when they got home from school. Also, many Generation Xers point to the rise of MTV as a part of their coming of age experience. And as Generation Xers have corrected me many times before, this is the real MTV, not the MTV as it's known today. So let's take a look at some habits here. 55% of folks in this generation give. Remember, with the baby boomers, we were starting out with the baseline of 75%. So we have gone down on a statistically marked amount looking at Generation X. However, those who are giving are still giving about the same amount as their baby boomer peers, just a little bit less at $900 per year across 3.8 different charities. Taking a look at the selection of the total giving pie here, they're at about 25%. And as far as channels for giving go, you'll see that for the most part, online giving is their primary way they'd like to give, followed shortly by crowdfunding. Mail solicitation goes down. Social media giving is still there, promising at about 9%. And this is the highest category in terms of giving via text message. You'll notice those numbers are not very high across the board as you look at generations. What is interesting with Generation X, though, is seeing where places of worship falls for them. Places of worship actually falls number 6 on their list of giving priorities. So it's the lowest of any of the generations that we're going to talk about. So let's take a look at the millennials. Millennials' birth dates are 1981 to 1996, ages 40 to 25. This is my group. For many millennials, something that they remember as part of their coming of age experience that kind of defined for them, especially early millennials like myself, is the September 11th attacks. We also often hear that millennials are called digital natives. However, I frequently have to correct people that I was not born with an iPad in my hand. iPads did not exist when I was born, was not born with a cell phone in my hand. I can remember when computers came into my school and when they came into my home growing up, but it was certainly not something I was born with. That's actually Generation Z. However, part of my coming of age experience was also the rise of social media. I can remember graduating from high school and joining Facebook for the first time. It was part of kind of coming into adulthood for me. So 51% of folks in this generation give. That's about the same as Generation X peers, and they're giving an average of $591 per year, which of course is a little bit less than our Gen Xers and certainly less than our baby boomers. But they're still giving to 3.5 different charities. So even though they're giving a smaller amount, it's still going to the same amount of charities on average. Taking a look at the total giving pie, millennials represent 14%. And as far as channels for giving goes, I don't think you'll be surprised to see that online giving is top of the charts. Crowdfunding has actually surpassed online giving in the way they'd like to give. And again, these folks also appreciate giving via text, or at least as much as generations appreciate giving via text, they're on the top of the list. But again, text giving is pretty low across the board. One interesting surprise with this 2018 study of Next Generation of American Giving is millennials now have places of worship as the top of their list in terms of giving priorities. The 2013 edition of this study did not see this to be the case. So this has been something that's shifted over the last 5 years. So let's talk about the habits of Generation Z as we finish it off here. Birth dates here are 1997 to 2012. Obviously, those birth dates are still being determined as this generation is coming of age. Current ages are 24 to 9. These are the real digital natives. These folks also tend to have a more visual representation in terms of how they take in information. They were also born in the age of cell phones. Similarly, also, these folks want to be entrepreneurs. I've often heard it said about millennials that they're a part of kind of the hustle culture, the side hustle culture. They want to own their own side business, but a Generation Zer is focused on owning their own business, and having an entrepreneurial venture is very important to them. These folks, 44% of folks in this generation give, so it is a little bit less than millennial peers. I should also say here that we're just looking at Generation Zers that are 18 and up, of course, just for research purposes, and giving on average $341 per year, which I would say is pretty good, given that most of the folks in the study would have been in college or even potentially still in high school, across 4.6 different charities, so a few more charities than their peers. They represent a small subsection of the giving pie, 2%. And oftentimes people will say to me, Grace, why should I pay attention to Generation Z? It's not like they're even a big portion of the giving pie yet. I have to admit, that question always takes me a bit aback, because I feel like it's the church's responsibility to engage everyone around giving and generosity, no matter what level of the total giving pie they are. And as Jim said, if we flash forward to 2030 to 2040, these folks are going to become even more important to the sustainability of the congregation. And growing generous givers now is one of the best ways that we can create that future. Looking at channels for giving, for these folks, social media giving is on the rise for them. Crowdfunding is the primary way that they want to give. Their overall giving priorities, you can see listed there. Number 4 on their list is places of worship. So it's just a little bit below the top 3. A couple other things to know about giving mindsets. It's important for all donors to see the impact of their donation. As of 2013 edition of this study, the people who cared most about that were millennials and some Gen Xers. But this has been a way that the millennials had influenced up. Now, 5 years later, everybody wants to see the impact of their donation, and financial transparency is a key piece of helping people see that impact. Older donors, no surprise there, tend to prefer planned giving. Younger donors prefer small and spontaneous giving. And younger donors are more likely to appreciate recognition for their gift. So just a couple of trends that I want to note across the board as we look at from baby boomers to millennials, but I would say a lot of this applies to Generation Z as well. The easiest one on the top, I'm sure this comes as no surprise, we have a shift in terms of how people like to give, from giving via cash or check to giving electronically. This is something that's impacting all generations. I would say many baby boomers are also giving electronically, in addition to maybe giving via cash or check, just depends on who you talk to. There's also a shift in the motivation for giving. For many baby boomers that are sitting in the pews of our congregation, the thing that motivates them is duty and delight, in the words of Mark Allen Powell. They have a duty to give to the congregation, and they feel joy when they do that. Yet, for many of our millennials and Gen Zers, there's an additional layer here. Duty and delight is important, but they also want to know what the mission of your congregation is and how it's making a tangible difference. Last, we see a big shift from institution-based giving to cause-based giving. Now, interestingly enough, I have a baby boomer friend of mine. It's not Jim, it's a different baby boomer. And he and I have done a bit of a comparison game in terms of what organizations we give to. And if you look through the list of organizations that we both give to our colleges, we both give to our churches, there are many places that are exactly the same on our list, but we give for different reasons. For my baby boomer friend, he gives because those institutions have been an enormous part of his life. He appreciates the history, the legacy of that institution, and how it's going to be carried forward into the future. For me, it's about the cause. It's about a connection with the cause that that institution represents. Now you might say, Grace, isn't this a problem? Doesn't church fall on the institution side of this table? I think the church falls in both places. The church has a lot of cause-oriented things that can be brought up. And this isn't just the bright, shiny new projects that a church has going. This is the church's living, breathing mission and how that's lived out with your building, with your light bill, with your staff salaries. So many of these things can be folded under the umbrella of cause if the story is told that way. So I'd love for you to put in the chat, which generation do you most align yourself with? Usually if I'm together with folks in person, I'll have people raise their hand with different generations, but it'd be fun to see who we've got in the room with us today, if you're willing to share. Looks like we've got some Gen Xers, some boomers, a couple millennials, yes, love it. Oh yeah. Xers and boomers for the most part. This is great. Quite a few millennials coming in as well. Yes, I totally understand, Aaron. The millennial Zer line is kind of a tricky one. Yes, this is fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing which ones you come from. This is great. So moving along, To our next section, getting to know these folks, the Generation Xers, the Millennials, and the Gen Zers. I'd love to share with you a little bit more data so you can get a bigger grasp on who these folks are, and some research that I did in this area a couple years back with folks at this age demographic to hear how they feel when generosity, stewardship, and transparency are brought to the table. So just a quick blush at the demographic trends. Hopefully you know that millennials have now outstripped the baby boomers in being the largest generation in terms of population in society in America today. So that's an important thing to also kind of keep in view as you're thinking about how much weight you want to put into reaching millennials. Similarly, as we go down through the generations in America, generations are becoming more and more diverse, with Generation Z being the first generation to have 1 in 4 members that are Hispanic. And depending on what study you're looking at, Generation Z actually is sitting on the 50% line in terms of non-Hispanic white. And in some studies, actually the non-Hispanic white is less than 50%. So this is a very diverse demographic, and I think that's important to remember as we're sharing this message. Looking at education, jobs, and debt, you'll notice that this chart only takes into account millennials. No surprise there, millennials are better educated than prior generations, and education has only increased as we look across the generational spectrum. And I would guess Generation Z will beat us with our position on that and be even more educated than millennials are. However, especially when we're talking about stewardship, it's important to remember that just because you have a college degree does not mean that you're working in a job that requires that degree. 41% of recent grads work in jobs that do not require a degree, which is especially important when we take into account the impact of student loan debt. I love this title that Hadley Malcolm had in this USA Today article, Millennials Ball and Chain, Student Loan Debt. This ball and chain is following folks around from all different generations who have the student loan debt. Taking a look at the numbers, the outstanding student loan debt numbers are $1.7 trillion. The average outstanding balance for a 2019 graduate who has debt is around $30,000. And I think it's important to note those folks who took out Parent Plus loans, 14% of 2019 graduates' parents who took those out, their average was around $37,000. Sorry, you can't see that on the bottom there. Oh, just got to grab that here. And the 2019 graduates who had debt is 7 in 10, 7 in 10. So if you're talking to a Gen Zer or a millennial who graduated from college, very likely you're talking to someone who has student loan debt. Now, again, I realize that student loan debt affects many different generations, but studies have been done to show that the most acute feel of that student loan debt is coming on the weight of those who are recently graduated. I think it's also important to note the intersectionality factor with this as well. 54% of all student loan debt is held by white or Caucasian student borrowers. However, Black and African American college graduates owe more on average. And 4 years after graduation, about 50% of those students owed on average 12.5% more than they borrowed. And they tend to be paying more. The reason why I bring up student loan debt in a conversation about financial transparency and financial stewardship is if we're going to be talking with people about generosity and we are not talking about this monkey that they're carrying around on their back, their student loan debt, I think that we've done them a real disservice. I don't think we have a right to enter the room to have this conversation if we're not also going to be open about those things that are inhibiting their generosity. So the last thing we're going to look at in terms of demographics is social media, because social media is one great way that you can share the story of what your congregation is up to, share stories of generosity, and open up financial transparency. However, often when I bring this up, people say, oh, social media, it's just for the young kids. Well, in fact, it's not. Looking at US adults who say they've ever used any of these platforms, 81% have used YouTube and 69% have used Facebook. So really it depends on the forum that you plan to use. This study is from 2021, and we know that these numbers have gone up in the midst of the pandemic as people have been forced to use other means to communicate with one another. Now, of course, it's important to take a close look at which of these different social media outlets you want to use, depending on the demographics that you want to reach. As you can see up top with Snapchat, if you're looking to reach Generation Z and even some millennials, you might be in a good spot. But if you want to reach those age 65 plus with Snapchat, it might not work so well for you. YouTube across the board has generally pretty good ratings, as does Facebook. But again, it depends on who you're trying to reach with your message. The next thing I'd like to share with you guys is some research that I've done in this area. This research is a few years old, but I think it still lends value to this conversation, particularly as it relates to financial transparency. This was a study I did because honestly, I was finding that most of the studies and conversations out there about stewardship really only involved baby boomers. And I wanted to talk with people like me about stewardship and generosity and get their perspective. I talked to over 65 people in the Twin Cities area, suburban congregations and urban congregations. This certainly lacks diversity, but I still think there are things here that we can take from this study as we join in having a more honest conversation about how finance functions in our congregation. One of the first and most interesting things that I learned in the midst of this study was that people were longing for space for conversation. Anyone who was involved in this study was under the age of 40 at the time. At that time, it included Generation Xers and Millennials. I don't believe there were any Generation Zers included in the study because they would have been a little bit too young at that point. But the reason why I found this idea of space for conversation was actually on accident. I would often do these focus group or interview conversations in the evenings or on a weekend, and people would come up to me afterward and say, "Grace, we're just so glad you came. It was a great experience." And honestly, as someone who hails from Minnesota, if you're not from Minnesota, maybe this won't make sense to you. I thought it was a bit of a Minnesota nice gesture, kind of a passive aggressive, like, thanks for being here, but I really wish that I was home binging on Netflix this weekend instead of having this conversation with you. However, when I would kind of say, okay, thanks, see you later. I hope you guys have a good night and kind of brush them off. Sometimes people would stop me and say, "Grace, you don't get it. You coming into our congregation, having a conversation about stewardship, about generosity and finance. This was the first time I could talk about these things with my peers where there wasn't an ask involved." How often in your congregation is there a space to talk about money, to talk about what the church is doing, and to talk about personal finances where we aren't also asking people for money? That is what I heard these folks were really longing for. I asked them what stewardship meant to them, and no surprise, over half of folks said it didn't resonate or it had a negative connotation. A 20s research participant put it well. He actually bristled at this word. It's a veneer on this thing of "we want your money." There are positive meanings, but it mostly feels like a con word. When positive meanings did come up, and it took a little bit of time in the conversation each time to get it to move to the positive side, taking care of people or places was a top topic, and the connection between congregational stewardship and environmental stewardship. As I looked through my different notes that I had on this study, I looked for the connection where stewardship and another word was used. And the top 3 words that were connected with stewardship for this audience were community, faith, and mission. Another key word, as I just shared with you a minute ago, was care. So as you think about the ways you talk about stewardship and generosity, if you want to open the doors and talk about transparency as well, these are words that you might want to use in those conversations. So thinking about what motivated people to give their time. The congregational community was a high-level motivation. The fact that they were asked was a big deal, and they wanted their time to be used well. Things that were holding them back: schedule, time commitment, and childcare. They wanted you to be crystal clear on what you were expecting of them. I can remember I studied with a bunch of different denominations, and there was one, I believe was a Methodist congregation, and this young couple had just joined, and they were invited to be confirmation leaders. And they thought, oh, that sounds like a great way to get involved and connected in this place. However, what they found out after attending their first meeting was they had just signed themselves up for a 2-year commitment. They had no idea what they had signed themselves up for, and they were very gun shy to participate in anything else after that moment. So being clear about time commitment and not just assuming everyone knows is a good idea. Looking at motivations for giving money. the mission of the congregation was the primary motivation. And this isn't just the nice mission statement that's kind of written on the top of a annual report document that you might have for your congregation, or maybe it's even weaved in a tapestry that hangs in your fellowship hall. This is the real living and breathing mission of the congregation that someone can articulate. That mattered to this group a lot. Transparency was high up on this list. They wanted to know where money was going, and a line item budget just wasn't going to cut it for these folks. They needed someone to help them connect the dots between their gift and the impact that it was making. The things that were holding them back: living paycheck to paycheck, life uncertainty. I thought that competition from other nonprofits would come up a lot, but it came up very rarely. The last piece is money being used inefficiently. There was one congregation that I studied, and I didn't know until I came there that there was a history of financial mismanagement, and it was having an enormous impact on people's ability to give to the congregation. They just didn't know if they could trust again after that moment. And from what I could tell, things had kind of been swept under the rug, and the hope was that people would just get over it and move on. But in reality, what I heard from folks is, if you have that financial mismanagement, people want you to be out loud about what happened and how things have changed. And if that's the case in your congregation, this is a really, really important piece. Let's take a look at how money is talked about. In most congregations, money was not talked about at all, except for when they were asking for money in a giving appeal or having a conversation about the budget. Only one of the congregations that I connected with talked about how money was used in all of a person's life, not just how they were giving to the congregation, and folks were very appreciative of that. There was a strong desire for more personal finance and credit card conversations at the congregation level. So I'm curious, I'd love to see you put in the chat. How often is money talked about in your congregation? Is it talked about not really at all, seldomly, maybe a few times a year? We'd love to hear how often it's talked about. Mostly during stewardship. Rarely, seldomly, not very often. Once a year. Time, talent, and treasure. Yes, thank you for that. Yes. Primarily talked about during the stewardship time, it becomes pretty obvious, and maybe a couple other times during the year. Thank you guys for your responses on that. That's really helpful. The last thing I want to share from my research study was some questions that people encountered around giving. One of the biggest questions that people had is how much is appropriate to give? And I think this pairs really well with the conversation about financial transparency. Not that people were looking for a specific expectation of you must give $20 a month, but they just had no idea what the range was, as you can see from this quote. And pledging. A lot of the folks that I talked to found pledging really daunting. As I often say to congregations, if you're inviting people to pledge with the word pledge, you are likely the only place where people in this demographic are pledging. They might be giving other places, but they don't think about it in terms of a pledging sense. Pledging is daunting, and they fear not knowing if they can make this commitment, so they're going to underestimate their giving. That's why I often encourage congregations to use an estimate of giving card or some language similar to that, just so people don't feel like they're completely locked in if something changes in their life. So let's lead this back to transparency here for a minute. Why does transparency matter? These demographics, focusing specifically on millennials, Gen Zers, and Gen X, tend to be skeptical of institution. This idea that your church has brand recognition within your community is no longer enough. You need to represent how you're connected to specific causes that they care about. Number two, I often see on Instagram these days, and I'm guessing many of you have as well, this idea of show me the receipts. Show me the receipts. And that doesn't necessarily mean you're showing receipts from every individual purchase at the congregation. They want proof. If you say that your church has an impact in your community, if you say that you care about racial justice, they want you to show them. Show them what actions have been taken. Show them how money has been allocated that really stands behind these values. Your impact and your actions speak louder than your words. These folks are cause-oriented. They have specific values that they care about that drew them to your congregation, and they want to see how money is flowing towards those things. If they care about children, youth, and family ministry, they want to see how money is flowing there. You have to remember that these folks overall tend to have less experience with church. They also may not understand the church's financial system. During the conversations I had in my research study, I heard a lot of interesting theories. People wondered if it functioned like the Vatican did, where people were sending money from on high to make these congregations run. They were curious how churches got their money, and they did not know the fact that Jim explained earlier, which is that most money came from the offering plate. And last, your silence speaks volumes. Nonprofits are telling their story 24/7, day in and day out. They have something to say about what they are doing in the world. And when you don't tell your story, people begin to wonder if there's really a story to be told. So how might you increase transparency? Before I jump into this, I just want to say one quick kind of disclaimer about this. Oftentimes, people think transparency is important, particularly if you're a congregation that is struggling financially and you want to be able to bring in more funds. And absolutely, transparency is important in that situation. However, I know for many of you on this call, that's not necessarily the situation that you are dealing with at the moment. You may have an endowment that's helping you with your funding. You may have other income sources that are coming in, or you may have really steady income coming in through the offering plate, even in the midst of the pandemic. It's just as important for you to increase transparency. Share with you a quick story. My parents, I'm Lutheran now, but my parents actually recently joined an Episcopal church, and I won't tell you where because I know they're a part of SEEP. And this church is beautiful. And I remember going there with my dad to a church service, and they had a professional choir and they had a big pastoral staff. And yet we were sitting there in a service with 35 people. Now, as someone who studied math and finance in college, I'm already sitting there saying, I don't understand how you can have 35 people in worship and 7 people on your staff. What's the story here? And honestly, I don't give to that congregation because I'm not personally connected with them. But for me to make that gift, I would have wanted to know more of that story. Where is the congregation's income coming from? What is their mission and what matters to them? Now, luckily, this congregation does a great narrative or missional budget every year where they tell that story. And my dad has since shared it with me. So I've heard more of the story of what they're up to. But it's really helpful for those people coming in for the first time to not be left with that level of confusion. I encourage you to take a beginner's approach to church finance and generosity. Do not assume that people know where your money is coming from or that they know why your church matters. You've got to make the case. Get clear on what your mission is. As I often tell my students at seminary, this is your why, according to Simon Sinek. What is your why? And how would you explain to someone not only inside your church who's been there for 40 years, but someone outside of your congregation, why your church matters? And then back up that story with impact. Use a narrative or missional budget to talk about your congregation's money and mission. In other words, break out that line item budget, pair those different numbers up with your mission, and tell the story using different visual graphics, different quotes. You might even divide it up by mission. So for instance, if your mission is caring and teaching and justice, divide up the different areas of your budget into those categories and tell the stories of what you've been doing with those budget numbers. So it doesn't look like here's the building, here's the salaries, and here's what we spent on benevolence, but it really tells the story of what you're doing with your building and salaries and benevolence. Be upfront about any dirty laundry. If your congregation has had some issues with financial ineffectiveness, be clear about that, because honestly, even if you think that dirty laundry is already clean, and it's 5 years later, someone new coming into your congregation may hear on the sidelines that story and be left confused. So being transparent and open about what happened and how things have shifted is really vital. And the last piece, consider the whole supply chain. People want to know the way the church saves, spends, and gives money. If you say that you have a value, show how you are living that out. not just with the money you're spending, but also with how you are saving, how you're investing that endowment, for instance, the money you're giving away in terms of benevolence, even down to things like what kind of cups you're using during coffee service. Those things really matter to this audience. And I neglected number 4, but this one's really important. Make those stories of impact real. Make them tangible, shareable, and frequent. If you share these on social media in a quick and quippy way, you better bet that your millennials and Gen Xers will be the first to want to share those with their audiences on social media as well. So the last thing that I just wanted to share with you guys, since Luther Seminary may be new to some of you, is that we have a Faith Lead website, which is a hub for Christian leaders, and we'd love to have you be a part of it. It's entirely free. You can also find resources from the Stewardship Leaders Program, which is the program that I lead on that website. We have a weekly newsletter that goes out around stewardship with timely issues and articles. We'd love to see you as a part of that group. And we also have a free resource called Stewardship 101. So if you're trying to train that new stewardship person on a committee, this is a great resource to do it with. All the things I've talked about are free. And that leads us to a time for questions. And from what I saw, it looks like there were a few of them in the chat.
Grace, one of the early ones that I saw that was actually in the Q&A section was asking if we had any information on disposable income availability across the generations and how that might affect giving. I don't know if you have any observations you want to share there.
Yeah, I mean, I could share observations. I don't have data on that, but I would love to get some. I'm sure it exists out there. But to be honest, the student loan debt piece really leads us into that conversation. A lot of folks in these younger generations don't have as much disposable income because, as we said, many are dealing with student loan debt, and often they're working in jobs that don't require a degree, so they're not earning the amount they might have expected coming out of college.
Grace, another question in the Q&A was, could you explain crowdfunding one more time?
Yeah, absolutely. So crowdfunding is all about smaller gifts coming together to make a big impact. So for instance, trying to think of a good example recently. So I recently, I noted earlier, I'm in Minneapolis, and as I'm sure any of you who watch the news know, we've been in quite a situation down here, and I was giving to one of the businesses in Brooklyn Park the other day. I did that through a GoFundMe page. This business was raising thousands of dollars to help them rebuild after some damage that had been done to their building. And I gave a gift of $50, I think at that time. Other people were giving gifts of $5, $10, $20, but together we were going to raise thousands of dollars. Oftentimes crowdfunding uses platforms like Kickstarter, GoFundMe, Indiegogo, but it doesn't necessarily have to be done that way. I've also seen these done offline through asking every person in the youth group to give $5 in order to raise money for a specific cause.
You know, Grace, the other thing I would comment on, I wouldn't want this group to leave our presentation and think, oh, you know, we got to do this. It's changing and it's all bad. Actually, there's some indications that this handing of the baton could be really good for churches. There was a poll conducted by FrontStream that talked to 1,000 American adults who had made a charitable contribution in the previous 3 years. It was conducted in February of this year. And they were asked whether they were planning to contribute $500 or more this coming year in 2021. 55% of the millennials said they were, and only 26% of the baby boomers said they were. So it wasn't a church-specific crowd, but I think it indicates that there's promise in all of what you and we have described here today. It's not necessarily bad. It's just going to be different, and we got to respond to it.
Absolutely. I would agree with you completely. It's just a change of guard in some ways, but I think what's really important is if you're sharing these messages with baby boomers in particular, they're still going to resonate with these stories of impact. It's not as if that's going to turn them off.
Grace, one of the questions in the Q&A is whether the student loan debt is higher for these younger generations than it was for older generations.
Yes, by far. And often one of the questions that I get is, does this fit with a general inflation pattern? And what we have seen over the course of the last few years is that it has outstripped inflation. So if you're curious from a mathematical standpoint, it is not only higher, but it has outstripped inflation. And hopefully it will level off at some point here. We can only hope.
A few more questions for us. What are some examples of other names or words for stewardship?
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of the word stewardship. I actually wrote a book a few years ago called Embracing Stewardship. So I'm kind of in a bad situation when it comes to that, because I think stewardship's the only word that gets us at ownership. That being said, I've worked with congregations who've really struggled with that word in their context, and they've usually moved to generosity or gratitude as the words that they've latched onto. But what do you think about that, Jim? You have a book coming out on this topic.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think your research was sort of interesting in that it was, you know, a touch point for some folks that had some negative, you know, kind of connotations to it, but it's very biblically grounded. You know, I think stewardship's a very comfortable concept for me, and I'm not sure that we don't have a challenge in front of us to educate folks on what it really means rather than run away from it.
Yeah, and do you mind, Jim, if I just pick up one of these questions from the chat?
Yes, please.
I see one in there that is interesting to me. So Kate, I love your question. If you use the phrase estimate of giving, that won't work when you do a budget. You can't say our estimated deficit is blank because there isn't a bigger commitment that a pledge brings. So because Jim can tell you this is actually coming from about an hour-and-a-half long presentation I've condensed down. So you missed one of the stories I get to tell with this, so I'll share that now. Pledging, the reason why that turns some of these folks off is because they have a concern about how their life situation might change over the next year. And especially as you're a young adult, you're in a different kind of more uncertain job economy. And particularly in light of the last year with COVID, people might be nervous about saying, this is exactly what I'm going to give. In fact, there was a story from my research study of a woman who was on a church council, vestry in this language, and she had committed her giving and she lost her job. And she called the congregation crying because she felt that she had made a locked-in commitment and did not know how she was going to make that happen after losing her job. The word estimate of giving isn't designed to make people feel loosey-goosey, but more to remind people that this is the commitment we're making together, but we also realize that when your job is lost and your hours are reduced, things are going to shift for you. And we can only hope and believe that there are going to be other people in our community whose situation changes for the better. They get a promotion. Their hours are not reduced in the midst of COVID, and they're not spending money on travel. So we can begin to fill in each other's gaps. It's not meant to be kind of throwing putty up at the wall. Rather, this is kind of the same view of pledging, but gives people the freedom and flexibility to know that we understand life situations change.
Grace, I see another question here that I think you are uniquely qualified to answer, and I'm delighted it didn't come to me. A related issue here, not just to the money part of how do we deal with millennials and Gen Xers differently, is how do we get the millennials and Gen Xers to come into the congregation in the first place? They have to be part of that community of faith before you can tap them on the shoulder and ask them to give. Any words to the wise from your perspective, not only as a millennial, but from Luther?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, some of this will come out of my congregation. So my congregation is essentially all people under the age of 40. It's the first congregation I've ever been a part of that's like that. And I would say that the people who come to our congregation are attracted to the idea that this is a more casual environment. We do a dinner church environment. We talk openly about issues that matter to millennial and Gen Zers, particularly the environment, racial justice, a variety of different social justice concerns, which I know many of your congregations do, but you might do it in a very different way than what a millennial or Gen Zer can hear. And I would also say we meet outside of a church building for a particular reason, because we know many of these folks have a negative connotation with the institution, even though they might be interested in the cause. So I think for those of you in a more traditional church setting, which I'm guessing is everybody on this webinar, one of the things that I would suggest for you is think about how you can make different pieces of your congregation more open to a millennial and Gen Zer audience. How might you make some of the causes that you're raising money for interesting to a millennial and Gen Zer that isn't necessarily associated with your church? Maybe you make volunteering in different parts of your church more open to those who are unchurched. Often those are the doors that millennials and Gen Zers will come through that you might not expect. You may not see them in church on Sunday, but they might be interested in volunteering or giving money to specific causes that impact their community.
Another question that I think is tied to the one you just answered is, can you talk about tying financial and environmental stewardship in congregations, connecting the two?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's really imperative that we're connecting the dots in that area, particularly even as we think about small pieces in terms of how we are showcasing our care for sustainability in the things that we're buying for our congregations and the things we're using in our congregations. And to be honest, in the ways that we're investing money as a congregation, how are our investments showcasing that we care for the environment? Because I'm guessing for many of you on this webinar, that's the largest asset your church has. So it's a great way to illustrate your support for sustainability.
Johnny, I know we're starting to run out of your time.
Right. Well, is there one more pressing question? I think we have about 5 to 10 minutes.
Sounds good.
See any?
I'm trying to look through the list. So many good ones. Yeah, so I want to take this question from Lisa, and I bet, Jim, you'll have something to say on this too. So the implications of tax implications of giving have changed. How can the church address that? So the great news is for millennials and Gen Zers, many of them may not have even known that this tax implication was a real deal. So you're not necessarily having to make the case with them that giving to the church still matters. The thing that's motivating to them to give is the cause, not the tax differential that they're going to have. So you're not going to have to make as much of a case. But I would say this has had more of an impact on some of our older givers. Jim, would you add on to that?
Yeah, I agree. When the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act made the standard deduction so much higher, there was definitely a palpable but hard to quantify impact on a certain level of givers. But I'd like to think, as you just said, Grace, that folks give to their churches for different reasons other than just the tax deduction, and that we can persevere and live through this as well.
Absolutely.
Well, I would like to thank you, Grace, for sharing your research. You've done a fantastic job, and I'm sure that you brought out many ideas that they had not thought about, and you will send people away with a real interest in what's happening across the generations with regards to finances in the church. And Jim, thank you for being with us, and good luck on your book. And
Thanks,
for
Johnny.
those, and what was the title of it again?
Creating financially sustainable congregations.
Okay, wonderful. Creating financially
sustainable congregations. Yep.
Oh, sustainable congregations, because I saw a couple people ask that question. So make sure you look for it. It's out tomorrow. And for those of you who took the time to come to the seminar, I hope that you gained lots of information, because there was plenty of it given. And also, this will be it was recorded, so therefore you will be able to go back and see it again, or perhaps share it with others in your congregation. So thank you all for coming, and one more time, Jim and Grace, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Johnny.
Mm-hmm.